Hi, everybody. Welcome to AI TV. My name's Nick Bradshaw. I'm the host of the channel. We're the sister channel to AI Expo Africa. So we spend all our time talking to thought leaders across the continent, around the world, who have an interest in tech in Africa. And it gives me great pleasure to welcome Maxime Bayen from the head of venture building at the Catalyst Fund, and also the co-founder of Africa, The Big Deal. Been doing some really interesting analysis over the last few years on the tech investment landscape in Africa. And I've been wanting to talk to Max for a long time. So Max, welcome to the channel.
Hi, Nick. Thank you very much for having me.
So Max, you're sat there in hopefully sunny Barcelona. I'm sat down here in Cape Town. And I mean, for people that don't know you and the work that you've been doing, obviously there's a venture capital investment side to what you do, but also you've been doing this amazing analysis, which is incredibly insightful about the dynamic of the African tech landscape and the investment trends. Do you want to tell us a little bit about that origin story? Because I've been following you for a long time, but many people might be new to what you do. How did that all start?
Sure. Yeah. So it really started as a pet project, as you would call it, and that was, I think, back in 2019 or so, end of 2019. I was basically looking for data on startups. I wanted to actually write a blog about startups that had raised $1 million in the past couple of years. And I thought, well, for sure the data is available somewhere. So I started looking. I couldn't find it either, in an affordable way or a comprehensive way. So then I thought, okay, it cannot be that many, so let me compile it. I knew already some, so like, okay, I'm gonna start compiling it. And then, of course, it took longer than expected. But after a couple of days, I had a list, and I started sharing it. On social media and so on. And I realized, I was not alone looking for this kind of data. So then it became a little bit of a thing. I kept tracking that. And then when it became too much for a single person to handle, I started working with a good friend, Max Cuvelier, who helped me as well. And we turned it into something a little bit more sustainable as well. On the commercial front. So that's really the story, but it's always been something on the side, and really, as many companies out there, it started because of a problem we faced.
Yeah, well, I mean, actually that's how I found you guys. I had exactly that same challenge. I started the AI Expo Africa community, and I was looking for analyst information about the AI landscape in Africa, and I came across a startup report that was the global AI startup report. I think it was like 2017 or something, and Africa was empty. And I wrote to the researcher and said, hey, I've got about 80 companies that I could offer you, and with no reply. So then I thought, well, hang on a minute, who else is doing this? And then that's how I found you guys. So I mean, I've been following you for a long time, but just for our viewers and just to kind of position the data that you look at, you're essentially looking at investments, which I believe, and correct me if I'm wrong, over $100,000 in any stage of investment in the life cycle of a startup, and they're based or founded in Africa. Is that correct?
Yes, that's all exactly correct. That's what we're focusing on. And yeah, there's of course, definition challenge on what's an African startup. We actually purposely don't call them African startups, but actually startups in Africa. And I'm sure we can cover that in more depth. But one of the reasons for that is for good or bad, but it's like that. A good number of the companies that are operating in the continent are not necessarily primarily registered in the continent. So that's why we have this definition of basically operating in Africa, ideally run by a team locally as well. But yes, it's a bit of a gymnastic on the definition front for sure.
Well, I mean, even with those gray edges around definitions, I mean, there is this healthy, very healthy, active startup ecosystem, accelerator, investor ecosystem around the African startup landscape. Obviously, also a lot of people don't understand how big Africa is as a piece of real estate. I mean, it's a big old territory. So you got Arabic North, French West, got South Africa, Sub-Saharan Africa, East Africa. They're very different dynamics in all of those regions and countries. But I mean, having now gathered, I think, 4 years now of data, what are these common trends? What are the themes that you've been seeing? I mean, apart from the recent kind of slowdown, perhaps, which we'll come on to in a minute, but what were the mega trends that you saw over this 4-year period?
That's a good question. Well, there's the biggest trend. I mean, the two biggest trend for sure. Let's make it three. Good things go by three. Yeah. The first big one I would say is the growth of it overall. When we started looking at it in 2019, the total amount of funding was really low. I think it's just above $1 billion. Fast forward to last year, it was above 4. And that's really just in the course of 3 years. So the growth rate of the ecosystem overall has been phenomenal. Last year alone there were more than 1,000 deals, which was the first year ever to have so many deals in the continent. So that's definitely very impressive. Last year Africa was the fastest growing startup ecosystem worldwide. In terms of amount of funding raised, growth of the amount of funding raised. So yeah, that's the first big trend we're seeing is really more deals, more investors. Last year we also had it's very easy to remember because they also had more than 1,000 investors, unique investors that signed checks to startups last year. So 1,000 deals, 1,000 investors.
Yeah, I mean that in itself is a story, right? I mean, I think everyone thinks, oh, the only people investing in tech, there's about 10 VCs and a few angels, but that's 1,000 deals and 1,000 different investors. I mean, that's an interesting message about what's going on and where to find money, right?
Yeah, exactly. And there is definitely a huge diversity of investors. Of course, most of them have just done one deal, the vast majority, but still it shows that there is some appetite. There's a number of investors that have done only deals in outside Africa for many years, and then last year for the first time they did one deal in Africa. And it needs to start somewhere, so that's very encouraging. So that's the first big trend, the growth overall, number of deals, amount of money, number of investors, everything is growing. The second trend is in terms of sectors. Clearly the past 5 years have been the years of fintech for the continent, consistently growing year on year, both in relative and absolute terms. Actually in 2021 it was more than half of the funding that went to fintech startups. In 2022 was the first time that relatively speaking fintech decreased. It was just north of 30% of all the funding, but it's in parallel you are seeing a lot of what we would call embedded fintech models grow. So it's not necessarily labeled as a fintech, but it's basically a solution in agriculture that basically does lending to farmers as a core service. So it's it's also a fintech. So we're seeing more of this, maybe a bit less of the the typical pure play fintech like neobanks and so on, but more of the embedded fintech kind of model. So definitely massive sector for the entire ecosystem. So that's the second trend I would highlight. The third one is really on geographies. There's been clearly 4 countries that dominated the past 4 years. When we started that, it was 3. Now it's 4. I will come to the names. Of course, South Africa, Nigeria, Kenya, and then 2 years ago, it was a big 3. It became a big 4 with Egypt. Now part of this leading group.
I think also interesting when you started, South Africa was number 1, but I think South Africa is almost now number 4, right?
That's true. that's definitely the case. It's been a more complicated year in terms of the South African ecosystem last year, for instance. But yeah, definitely these big four, consistently representing over 80%. Again, last year for the first time it went below 80%, which means there is new countries, new ecosystems knocking on the door of this club. Indeed, and that's great. So we're seeing markets like Ghana, we're seeing Senegal, we're seeing Tunisia, we're seeing Morocco. There's really a lot of things happening. Uganda, Tanzania as well, in new ecosystems. So that's super encouraging. And so yeah, those I would say are the main trends. I would have absolutely loved to add a fourth one. And I would have loved to tell you that there's a growing ratio of female founders receiving funding in the African ecosystem. Unfortunately, that story is not a good one. It's actually quite flat. It's about 3-4% of the total funding that goes to startups led by female founders. And yeah, that's definitely not a good story. There's a number of funds that are trying to change things there. I'm proud to be working with one of them, Catalyst Fund, where we have a strong mandate to actually back at least 20% of female founders among our portfolio. But yeah, the rest of the ecosystem, I mean, it's not moving much. It's non-specific to Africa. Unfortunately, it's a bit of a global flat curve. But yeah, I think there's a number of us out there that are working hard to change this, and with more hard work and more investors joining us in this effort, maybe when we do the same interview, we'll see a change in this curve.
Yeah, I mean,
hello.
I think we just lost each other there, Max. Are you back? Can you hear us okay? Can you hear us, Max?
Yeah.
Brilliant.
Yeah.
Sorry. The challenges of long distance Zoom calls. So Max, if we look at the advice, so I mean, clearly by doing this analysis for the last 4 years, you've obviously built up a body of knowledge. And I mean, I'm meeting startup founders, startups growing, or trying to grow their business. I mean, what advice would you offer to a startup that's looking at Africa, either originated in Africa or thinking of setting up a startup in Africa? What would be the key advice that you would give them?
Yeah, well, there's a lot of things, first to look at that are not necessarily specific to Africa. But if we want to go about things that are a bit more specific to Africa and more linked to fundraising, which is, what we started this discussion about, there's a couple of things we tend to advise our portfolio companies at Catalyst Fund. The first one, again, whether it's a good thing or bad thing, I don't know, but it's like that, is to most likely want to register your holding company in the US. The reason why I'm not saying in the US or in Europe or in Dubai or in Mauritius is because, again, this is data backed. You have about a third of the investors who are active in the continent who are based in the US, and for them, especially at pre-seed stage, it will always be easier to invest in a US jurisdiction. When you do $100,000 investment, if you have to pay thousands of dollars of legal fees, your unit economics as a VC fund starts to become a little bit complicated. And you will have to pay these fees if you invest in a foreign jurisdiction. So that's definitely something that funds take into account. So, if you register if you're registered in Africa or elsewhere, and not in the US, you may still be able to fundraise. It's just that you're closing the door to about a third of the active investors.
Interesting.
So so that's definitely something that I would encourage to look at. And the earlier you do it, the better, because it's less costly. Your cap table is easier to manage. If it's just you and your co-founders, it's way easier than if you have like already 10 angel investors and so on the cap table.
Now, just on that point, then, I mean, everyone hears this phrase, you got to be registered in Delaware, right? That's the famous phrase that everybody hears. I mean, how easy? I mean, just is more for the anyone watching our interview. I mean, how does one go about doing that? Is there a standard process? I mean, could you, the Catalyst Fund guys, can you help with that process? How does one go about doing that?
Yeah, so very good question. So we do help our portfolio companies with that process, but it's not very complicated. I mean, there's actually some platforms that you can use to do that remotely. There's Stripe Atlas, there's First Base, there's Clerky. All these platforms can help you register in the US. And the registration part is not necessarily the hardest one. It becomes a little bit harder to do what we call the flip. So basically, moving whoever are the shareholders of your cap table to in your subsidiary in Africa, moving them as shareholders in the holding company in the US. That's a little bit more tricky. If it's just you and your co-founders, as I said earlier, that's not that complicated. If you already have a couple of investors on board, then you probably have to incur some legal fees and so on. So that's where it becomes a little bit more tricky. Another thing that you want to factor in as well in the time that all this requires is the opening of a bank account. And here again, probably if we had done this interview a couple of months ago, one of the recommended bank would have maybe be Silicon Valley Bank, like everybody else. Well, now we typically tell our portfolio companies to maybe go for a little bit more, I would say, traditional banks, and for sure try to diversify if you can. So you can have an account with Mercury and then an account with HSBC, and have a couple of options, let's say.
Yeah. Well, yeah, I mean, the recent Silicon Valley Bank, I mean, I even know a couple of startups here in South Africa that were impacted by that, but I think they came through it. But yeah, I mean, look, starting a company and having done it a couple of times myself, I mean, it's no easy undertaking. But as I said, or as you said, the sooner you do these things up front, like where do we register, where will we bank, that has become much more of a factor now, particularly for people in the emerging market economy. Whilst Africa is seen as this growth sector, there are these, well, as you say, you don't want to close the door to investment. You want to make it easy for investors to invest, remove any of those barriers up front. So it's definitely great advice. Thanks for that, Max. We'll obviously share and amplify that with our own community. Now, clearly, as you mentioned earlier in this conversation, fintech has been, the hot sector for 10 years or so. But your analysis has shown now that some of these other sectors are starting to come to the fore. They're attracting more interest. Over a 10-year period, things have changed considerably on the global scale of things. Bigger focus on sustainable development goals, bigger focus on things like resources, agri, health. Now, those are all topics which are very key to the African continent. What do you see as the hot sectors over the next 10 years, Max, and a sort of prediction, and what are you seeing from the ground?
Yeah, no, that's a good question. I will of course here have a bit of a biased answer, because I with Catalyst Fund we are very much focused in one sector. We're really on a mission within this specific sector, but coincidentally, it's also a sector that is super fast growing in the ecosystem, especially in the past 2 years, and that's the climate sector. So basically, solutions to either mitigate climate change or allow local populations to better adapt to the negative effect of climate change, which is what we call climate resilience or climate adaptation. And so, yeah, that sector overall, let's call it the climate sector, climate tech sector, has grown quite significantly. Last year, it actually doubled and passed the $1 billion mark in terms of funding raised by startups in that sector in Africa, and definitely super fast growing. Of course, you have a number of subsectors within that. It spans from agriculture all the way to I don't know, parametric insurance for farming, for instance, or for natural catastrophes. It can include things like carbon credits platforms. It can include things like early warnings in case of, again, natural catastrophes. So it's quite a wide topic, and of course, things like access to water, access to energy, electric mobility. So it's quite wide, and actually a little bit cross-cutting other sectors. But definitely a sector that we see growing, that we believe will continue to grow, and on which we're seeing a number of investors also raising funds. Recently, we heard about a fund called Equator, which is sort of the same organization as Factor E, raised some funding. The guys at Goodwell also raised some funding. The guys from Climate Resilience Funds in Egypt also raised some funding. So there's definitely a number of funds playing in that space, and that's really something that we're super enthusiastic about. There's a lot of work to be done, clearly, and monetization models are not necessarily always proven yet. Things related to renewable energies, pay-as-you-go solar, and so on, have been now quite proven. But beyond these known models, there's now a couple of new models that need to be proven, and it's really important that investors put a lot of energy in proving some of these models. So yeah, very, very excited about this. What we are pushing towards with the team at Catalyst Fund is to double click a little bit more on what we call climate adaptation versus climate mitigation. In a nutshell, climate mitigation is how do we reduce CO2 emissions, which in Africa are just about 2 or 3% of the global CO2 emissions, so it's not that much. But on the other side, unfortunately, Africa is already severely facing a number of negative effects of this climate change.
Indeed.
So that's why we, whether it's floods or droughts, water scarcity, and so on, are already a day-to-day reality. And so that's why we believe it's urgent to focus on climate and basically using tech for climate adaptation solution. How do we help? How do we use tech to help local populations across the continent to cope with all these negative effects? So yeah, that's really the mission we are on, and we're excited to see more and more investors joining that kind of mission.
Yeah, it's fantastic, Max. Just to wrap up, my own community, that we're focused on AI and data science and related smart technologies, or deep tech sometimes. That is now an emerging sector in its own right, but equally it's cross-cutting as well. I think our analysis in our own research we published last year, the State of AI in Africa report, was we identified 121 different market segments that AI and smart technologies are impacting. And equally also, I think we had the largest ever African founded exit, which was InstaDeep, which is another sort of feather in the cap for AI and the African startup ecosystem. So look, whether it's a cross-cutting technology platform like AI, or you're in the climate tech, which itself is a vertical and a horizontal play, I think anyone that's in that space should get in contact with you. I'll put a link below for any climate tech wannabe startups. Just to clarify, Max, what stage of investment are you guys doing? Are you at the early stage? Where are you?
Yeah, we're at pre-seed stage,
Pre-seed, right.
And so yeah, we do an investment about $100,000.
Okay,
very, very early stage.
Well, brilliant, Max. It's I think we've been trying to make this conversation happen for a couple of months now, so I really do appreciate your time. And if anybody wants to find out more about the data that the team have been gathering over the last 4 years. I'll put a link below. The Africa Big Deal database. There's also a really interesting blog that goes with it, and all the I think, is it a monthly newsletter you put out? What?
Weekly.
So it's weekly, right? Okay. Yeah, I mean, there's so much great information that comes out of your research. I definitely recommend people should subscribe to the blog and the news feed, and obviously subscribe to the data set as well. So Max, I just want to say thanks very much for joining us here on AI TV. Hopefully we'll see you at AI Expo Africa in November in Johannesburg. But until then, keep up the good work, and good luck with the Catalyst Fund and growing that over time.
Thank you very much, Nick. It was great talking to you.
Thanks, Max.